Welcome back to Morning Express, and it is time for us to look at the state of the nation. Joining me to do that, we have, I'll start with my extreme left, where we have Honorable Moses Kajwang, who is the Senator for Homa Bay. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to have you.
Thank you.
We also have Chege Mwaura, who is an MCA in Ngara. Good morning and good to have you too.
Good to have me.
All right. Now, we'd like to look at several things, but first of all, we'd like to highlight and look at the shuttle diplomacy that has been going on, and this is in favor of Amina Mohamed becoming the chair for AU. And basically, let's start first of all with what the president had to say before we break it down and find out what benefit does it has for us as a country.
To introduce to you somebody who is very well known to you, somebody who has served the Republic, and I also believe the region and the continent very faithfully. I believe that we were submitting a name of an individual who is a consensus builder.
All right, so that is the president basically fronting the name for Amina Mohamed and to be the chair of the African Union Commission. So let me start with you, Moses Kajwang, and possibly just to highlight for us to understand fully, what does Kenya stand to benefit from this particular move?
Thank you, Mike. Remember, the African Union brings together more than 1 billion people in a continent that is considered to be the richest when it comes to natural resources, in a continent that is seen to be the next big frontier. And so the African Union is a powerful body if it was to execute its mandate faithfully. The African Union, the leadership of the African Union would place Kenya in a position that gives it greater visibility, not just within Africa, but globally. Remember also, there are certain deals, trade deals, that are signed by regional blocs. And when we have a Kenyan at the helm of the African Union, it means that when they are negotiating for Africa on the international stage, you know, there is that local memory, that local knowledge that might come in and that might benefit the people of Kenya. There is no doubt that Amina Mohamed is a hard-working cabinet secretary. So far, we have not had the corruption that has tainted the other cabinet secretaries, and we hope that we are not going to hear anything about her anytime soon. So far, she has executed a mandate with a lot of zeal. You have to admire her. When it came to IEBC, when it came to UN Conference on Trade, when it came to the World, the WTO, and the other global fora that Nairobi has hosted, you can see she has done it with zeal. And even if you love her, even if you hate her, you must give it to her that she's hardworking, and she's among the people in the current cabinet who portray an aura or an image of a state officer that Kenyans would like to have. However, Amina is not alone in the race. Regional blocs are fronting candidates.
Right.
So now we have the EAC, and I'm told COMESA has thrown its weight behind Amina, but we know SADC has a candidate. We know that ECOWAS has a candidate. There will be these regional dynamics. So Amina is now moving from a little pond to swim in a large ocean. And in that large ocean, there'll be bigger sharks. There'll be more experienced sharks. Some of the candidates that have been fronted by ECOWAS, for example, are people with much more solid credentials in leadership, not just at ministerial level or ambassadorial level, but people who have served as prime ministers, people who have true credentials as being Pan-Africanists, even if you go down to SADC. And so it's not a walk in the park. We should not assume that with the president and the deputy engaging in this shuttle diplomacy, it is going to be easy. In the earlier elections that were held, where there was no candidate who was elected, Amina was not a candidate. There were other players, and there were many other dynamics. So it's not going to be easy. But I would personally be happy if a Kenyan was the head of the African Union. It gives us pride, it gives us visibility, it's a good way of marketing and branding Kenyan, and I think Amina Mohamed would be a good candidate. She would be also an inspiration to the women of this country, that Kenya is capable of taking a woman and campaigning for that woman and placing her there. I pray, Mike, and this I must repeat, because the Jubilee administration surprises us. Because when you hail a minister as being hardworking, industrious, and being revolutionary in thought and mind, the next day you wake up and you find that there are corruption scandals within that ministry. I pray that her hands remain clean so that we can all rally behind her. We can all be proud of her as our candidate on the international stage.
All right, there's no doubt that she definitely has very good credentials so far. Her hands, like you say, are clean so far. Let me come to you, Bwana Mwaura. And of course, to the common mwananchi, what they would like to understand is, first of all, we've seen figures, you know, left, right, and center of how much this shuttle diplomacy is costing. Of course, it's also reminding us of something that many would not like to remember, and this is the hustler's jet. But that aside, is it worth it? How does the common mwananchi benefit? And somebody told me not to use that term because they said how common it's common. But let me say, how does the mwananchi benefit from now Amina Mohamed being there to a point where we're using the taxpayers' money to have all this done? How does that water down to what I benefit from?
Well, let me say that it's a larger stage than the current situation of Kenya. And of course, having to go through all the African countries, or, you know, looking for regional support and other, you know, friendly countries to support our bid, definitely will call for, you know, high-profile engagements. That's why the whole cabinet has been roped into this. The president, the deputy president are also, you know, roving around the continent looking for support. For a common mwananchi, I think it's a good thing. There is that fact, the feel-good factor. That is, you know, it makes you feel good when you see the likes of Dr. Mkisa Kitui up there. And then now you see we are also challenging to play a bigger role in our, not only a domestic foreign policy, but also having our contribution in an African context. Then again, the possibilities, I know one of the key issues would be inter-Africa trade. If we now open up the trading blocks and trading, you know, within the region and within Africa, then it opens up more opportunities for Kenyan farmers, more opportunities for Kenyan students who are, you know, entrepreneurs and all this. So for a common mwananchi, having a chance, if Africa learned how to trade with itself, of course. I mean, if you look at the biggest trading partners for Kenya, are our neighbors. So if we extend that to other 5 or so African countries, and then they also do the same, then it means the cost of doing production and cost of exporting stuff and importing, that also brings a lot of jobs to a Kenyan, and also opens up an opportunity for people to be able to do so many things without having to, you know, deal with visa issues and all those kind of things. So for a common mwananchi, I think it's a good deal, and I think it's money well spent for a good cause. Because at the end of the day, we open up, we want a bigger stake. And the foreign policy currently of Jubilee has been quite robust. It has been more aggressive than what we had before. And now with new arrangements, with new focus in African countries, having presidents who are now not serving for life, you know, with more ideas and all, I think there'll be some opening up. Okay. So I think having Ambassador Amina running for the show, or for running for this kind of a seat is perfect.
It's fantastic.
And it's good for
Moses, what a businessman would look at it in terms of his investment and the payoff. Is the investment that Kenya is making in this particular campaign going to pay off should she make it to be the chair?
Yeah, Mike, there are many theoretical benefits. Even if you look at a smaller block like the EAC, and part of my professional life, I worked in Uganda. And I do recall earlier, it was very difficult for Kenyans to go to Uganda and to get a work permit. And at some point when the Kibaki government took over, the immigration ministry and the government at that time decided to waive work permit fees for East Africans who are seeking to work in Kenya. It made life much easier for those of us who are working in Uganda and Rwanda and Tanzania. When you look at the flow of goods across the borders, so many of our young sisters and brothers, they go to Uganda to Owino market to pick products which, interestingly, are much cheaper in Uganda. Even if you factor in transport costs, they still land in Nairobi at a much cheaper
price. Yet they're more expensive in Kenya.
Yet they're more expensive in price. So when we open up the borders, it's good for everyone. It is good for the chicken farmer because there's a deficit of chicken in Uganda, for example. It's good for the dairy farmer because there's a deficit of milk in Uganda. It's good for the Ugandan sugarcane farmer because there's a deficit of sugar in Kenya, and the Tanzanian maize farmer because there's a deficit of maize in Kenya. So when you open up a bloc with more than 50 countries and more than 1 billion people, the market is immense, the potential is great. But I'm being cautious because these seem to be theoretical benefits. There's still a lot of protectionism within individual states, to the extent that within the EAC itself, we are still seeing a lot of barriers to trade, tariff and non-tariff barriers. The Africa Union, one of the most ambitious targets it has is to set up a monetary union by a certain date. I think it is by 2035. But there are certain other objectives of the Africa Union which many analysts feel have not been achieved.
Correct.
And one analyst observed that the starting point is the charter establishing the AU. If you compare that with the charter establishing the European Union, for example, the one for the European Union starts by saying, we the people of the European Union. But in the case of the Africa Union, it says, we the heads of states and presidents of Africa. So the Africa Union is seen as a dictator's club. And what made it worse was the election of Comrade Mugabe as chairman at some point. So a lot of theoretical benefits, but there's a credibility crisis. There are practical difficulties in achieving some of these benefits. For the Mama Mboga in Kenya, maybe with Amina's ascent to that high position and with the experience in trade negotiation and trade diplomacy, you might see a situation where Kenya will be able to export French beans to a country that has got a deficit of French beans, and it does not have to be within EAC or within COMESA. At some point, we might be able to open up even ECOWAS or open up SADC to trade, but it's going to take a long time. The more immediate concerns that the AU has has focused on has not been trade that much. It has been about political issues. And to that extent, there are many who think that the AU has failed because it has not been able to deal with issues of conflict decisively. It has not been able to impose good governance in the nation, in the member states decisively. We still have war, civil war flaring up all over Africa. We still have elections that are rigged. We still have situations that call for the intervention of the AU and a standby force, but the AU does not take any position. But that coupled with Kenya's diplomatic experiment in the last few years.
What do you mean by experiment?
Well, my colleague says, I think he used a politically correct word, that in terms of diplomacy, Kenya has been aggressive. In my view, Kenya has been a bully when it comes to its diplomatic approach. How have we handled the issue of Somalia? With aggression.
You mean the one of shutting down the refugee camp?
Shutting down the refugee camp. Our presence in Somalia, and a very protracted presence. Our action in southern Sudan, even though that was part of the UN. Our approach to ICC and how we attempted to negotiate and bully African states to take a position that at that point looked like was benefiting Kenya only. So when you look at Kenya's aggressive or bully approach to diplomatic issues, and you look at the AU's failure to be aggressive in certain ways, probably Amina Mohamed might bring in the much needed aggression that might turn the AU on its head and make it a much more proactive player when it comes to democracy and good governance.
All right, Maura, do you agree that, first of all, Kenya has been a bully in its approach to many diplomatic issues, or has that been literally Kenya being pushed to the wall and have no choice but to act? For instance, if you take the closing of the refugee camp, it's because of security issues as far as the government is concerned. If you look at Southern Sudan, it is because it was handled in a way that Kenya felt disrespected, according to the president. Are we being bullish, or is it just that we are our backs are to the wall and you have to fight back?
Certainly not. I don't agree with that approach that we've been a bully. But then again, right from the word go, when the Jubilee government was coming into power, remember the comments that, choices have consequences and all that. We were put in a situation where we had to come out and, put it out there that it's upon Kenyans to decide the direction that they want to take election-wise. When it comes to issues like Somalia, interest of the country must come first. How did we get ourselves in Somalia in the first place? The entry point through Lamu and, the attacks that were happening in Kenya and having all those things backed up in Somalia. And it was hurting our tourism. It was basically sabotaging our economy. So we had to act. Any president who would have been, having the kind of position and being given all those facts had to go, right ahead. And can we say that there are things that we can say that are positive? Of course, the issue of piracy was, has greatly gone down to very manageable or negligible levels. And Kenyan forces have been at the forefront because the Kenyan contingent operates around Kismayu, which is a port entry for Somalia. And look at the issue of South Sudan and the current row. Of course, you will also, the president takes an oath to defend the constitution and, of course, to protect its citizens, including the pride of that citizen. Right. So if the UN thought that it's a good thing to give a Kenyan whose credentials were okay at the time, and then other factors come into play, and then you look at the report and you see that you're going to download it on one person and feel that that one person needs to take the blame for a system that did not work out, and then again go ahead to have a very undiplomatic way of releasing that person. I think Kenya did whatever it needed to do by protecting its citizens. So it is not Kenya only that has a military that can go to South Sudan. So when Kenya says, for our own interest, we don't think that it is important to be handled like this, I think it's a good thing, it's aggressive, and it's good to come out and clearly state how we feel as a, as a country and how we feel as a government. Okay. So for me, that is important. On issues of whether the foreign policy, if you look at even ICC and how it was handled, and now if you see that the countries that started in Africa, that started saying that we need to relook at the ICC, the Rome Statute again, I think it's a good discussion. And I think there should be, between here and the world, there should be a buffer, probably at the AU, where Africans can come and say, this is what we think as Africans. Because also, ICC also has also been at the forefront of the majority of its clients have also been Africans. So actually, I think
there is
a
those who claim
point,
that it's there to prosecute Africans, basically.
Yeah. Mike, I think the aggression is could be one of Amina's strengths and one of her biggest weaknesses. Or one of Kenya's strengths, because Amina is now Kenya's candidate.
Correct.
So she might not, her personal credentials might not count as much as the country's position.
Yeah, in that position, she'd actually be going in as Kenya.
As Kenya.
Yes.
So Kenya's aggression, because between being assertive and aggressive, I would say Kenya has been aggressive, not assertive in its diplomatic policy. It has been aggressive.
But is there anything necessarily wrong with being aggressive?
Yes, diplomacy is about an iron hand in a velvet glove. You don't expose your iron hand. That is diplomacy. Politics is where you put on your iron hand and you don't have to glove it and you crush your opponents. But in diplomacy, you have to be subtle. You must put on your velvet glove. And I think Kenya's aggression will be our strength or our undoing. But to a greater extent, I believe that the manner in which we executed the campaign against the ICC, the fact that Kenya has its troops in two countries that it shares a border with, and there's usually some wisdom against countries deploying troops in countries that it shares borders with because of territorial issues and expansionist ambitions. That might jeopardize our chances as a country to ascend to that high position. And SADC is also coming up with a strong argument that Zuma served only one term, so they want to be given the opportunity to serve another 5 years term. We will see how things play out. But back to that common mwananchi, the Africa Union, if executed well, if the charter is properly executed, and of course with the relevant amendments so that it is not just about heads of states, and it is about the people of Africa. There is that vision that Gaddafi had. And there are many people who thought that Gaddafi was a madman at that point in time. But now that Gaddafi is dead and Libya is dead after him, people are starting to see sense in what he used to say, that Africa is strong when united.
Right.
There are people like Kwame Nkrumah and the doyens of independence who perceived an Africa that would be united as one continent rather than 52 or 53 disparate states. I think that vision, if we got someone who is visionary and action-oriented to drive it through,
and assertive.
Yes. And,
as opposed to aggressive.
Yes, it needs some assertion because it's diplomacy rather than aggression, because aggression might lead to further bloodshed and might lead to issues of borders being frayed.
Okay, you wanted to say something.
Yeah,
I want us to wind up on that and go to something else. But
I just wanted
as you
to
finish.
just use the same words of assertiveness and aggression. If we were aggressive, as he wants to say, then we would not have been dealing with the Somali government as we're doing. Because the Somali government, the one that is in place, and the president, there's been a very cordial relationship between the governments, and same for South Sudan. But then the only bit that we had a problem with was the insurgency that was being attributed to from Somali, the Al-Shabaab from Somali, and that's what we went to deal with. But as far as the two countries are concerned, we are still pals. We are still working out things together. If you look at the South Sudan government again, even the peace process is still happening in Kenya. There is no aggression, because if it was aggression, they would have thrown out the ambassadors from Kenya. And if it's Sudan and Somalia, majority of their top-wig politicians also operate from Kenya. Those are the first people who would have thrown out of Kenya. But that has not happened. So I don't think we are aggressive. Using his word, we are more of assertive than aggressive. Secondly, on the issue of why there is the wisdom of having countries that border each other not coming in militarily. But then it means Kenya was very proactive. Because as we were standing, Somalia was just running down the region, and no one was coming out. And even for the whole region. So when Kenya took up upon itself to go out and start defending, and that time we were still having piracy. And again, we went out and for me, it is more of a proactive situation.
And I think the issue with Somalia, as we wind up, may not have been whether we needed to go in or not, but the amount of time that we've spent in Somalia as well.
That's the issue. Because
and that should be the discussion.
There was a lot of consensus on Operation Linda Nchi. But the discussion that no one is allowing Kenyans to have is, when do we get our boys back? Because they are dying out there, but they've done a great job. Good. They've done a great job of pacifying parts of Somalia. And sometimes Jubilee wants to take credit, forgetting that Operation Linda Nchi was conceived under the Kibaki government. And one of the greatest advocates was Right Honorable Raila Amolo Odinga. There's never been a dispute on whether Kenya should have gone there, despite the fact that countries feel that they should not involve themselves militarily in neighboring states. But there was a reason, because there was no government in Somalia.
Okay.
The discussion is, when do we get our boys back so that we do not seem like we are an occupying force in an
All right. And that also needs to be backed up by very good background information that shows why we need to go, and shows that Somali government can be able to handle its own affairs like that, so we pull out. Otherwise, we just going to pull out, and then we now start again having
another Operation Linda Nchi. All right.
Unfortunately not, Mike. The decision and the story on whether Somalia government is able to handle its own affairs is a matter left to the people of Somalia, not to the military of Kenya. Kenya was supposed to safeguard its interest along the border and to crush Al-Shabaab such that it cannot pose a threat to Kenyans. If that is achieved, let's come back to Kenya. Let the people of Somalia
deal with their own government. All right, allow me to move to something else now, and I'd like us to look at the IEBC. This is now more local, and we do have 5 names that have already been basically shortlisted for IEBC. And remember, as we approach the 2017 election, would like to basically just look at that. And first of all, before we go to the funding, or maybe let's start with the funding that Now let's start with the names that have been given for IEBC and just look at the profiles. And if the director can help me retrieve that, the names that we have so far as the possible IEBC chair that we're going to have and the commission that is being set in place. And we start there with John Mutaha Kangu, who is a constitutional lawyer. He's a member of the defunct CKRC, chairperson of a task force and devolution, dean in the School of Law in Moi University. We also have Roselyn Odhiambo Odede, who is an advocate of the High Court, vice chairperson of the JMVB, founder member chair. We also have another name there, which is Margaret Wamboi Ngugi. I believe this is Margaret Shava, who is a trained lawyer, who is also a member of the TJRC, which we came up with a report and we don't seem to have much action having been taken from the TJRC. David Kiprop Malquen, who's Chief Legal Advisor, KCB Group, former Chief Legal Advisor of Kenya KP and TC. So basically, those are the 5 names that we have so far, and we don't have who's going to be the chair, but taking over from Isaac Hassan. And maybe coming to you, David Mereka, who is a High Court advocate, treasurer of FKF and Elections Board. And let me start with you, Moses Kejuang, in terms of as we approach the 2017 election, are you getting the feeling that we are getting a commission and a referee, because that's what we've referred to IEBC as, who is likely to be fair?
Yeah, Mike, we went to the streets because we felt that the outgoing commission had become partisan, it had integrity issues, and it had competence issues. And so it was our aspiration as an opposition and a broad section of the Kenyan public to have an umpire who would inspire confidence in the electoral process. And remember, this is an umpire managing an electoral process. So the electoral process is much bigger than the umpire.
Correct.
So yes, we are changing the faces. There's that old saying, same monkeys.
Different monkeys,
Different
same forest.
monkeys, same forest.
Yeah.
We must ask ourselves whether the electoral process, as envisaged by that select committee, is being implemented and is going to give us the kind of results that will give Kenyans the assurance that even with new monkeys, the forest is going to be
And that remains the question, Senator. Now that we're changing the faces, have we put in place a structure that can be devoid of the faces? I mean, if you compare, like, for instance, now the election in the US, we are not asking who is it that was running the election.
Yep.
And nobody even cares to know. But the fact of the matter is, at the point where they announce them, they're credible enough to a point where, despite people going into the streets, the president can come out and say that Donald Trump is president-elect. Let's respect that.
Because they've got a process that has been tried and tested. It's a process that has run. It has had its failures, especially remember the Al Gore and George Bush, where there were some issues and especially on the electoral technology. It has been tested. It has failed in some areas. It has largely succeeded. Ours, we still don't even know what shape it's going to take. Why? Because the select committee that received wide acceptance across the political divide. And by the way, I've not seen in the last 4 years a process that has received such unanimous support from members of the National Assembly, from members of the Senate, and from the 2 leaders of One CORD and Jubilee. It is this process that received the most overwhelming support of any other process in this nation. But when you go to the details, it is my personal view, it is not the view of my coalition, it is my personal view, that there were certain timelines, there were certain issues that were put in there with the aim of sabotaging the process. And let me give you an example.
But the timelines were put by the select committee.
Let me give you an example. Yes, and they were approved by Senate, where I sit, and they were approved by the National Assembly. We have a unique and very worrying situation where the commissioners that led us to go to the streets and led to the deaths of many people and the injuries of many people, especially in my county of Homa Bay, Migori, Siaya, and even here in Nairobi and in Kisumu. The commission that we wanted to get out is still in office. Why? because of some looseness in the wording of the recommendations. The recommendations were very clear that those commissioners were to hand over to new commissioners who shall be appointed not later than 25th of September. Now we have gone back to our legal cleverness, and we are saying that these outgoing commissioners can only hand over when new commissioners are appointed. And yet the recommendation said that must happen by 25th of September. So you've got some looseness in wording of certain recommendations that encourages people who are mischievous to misinterpret the intention, the spirit of the work of that select committee. That is what is going to lead us into problems. You've got a situation where we have said that we must procure electoral technology 8 months before the next elections. And in procuring of that electoral technology, stakeholders must be consulted. And stakeholders include political parties. What does the outgoing commission do? They go and consult a body called Political Parties Liaison Committee that has got parties that have since been swallowed up by Jubilee. When we were setting up the select committee, we didn't go to the Political Parties Liaison Committee. We were clear in our minds as Kenyans that there are two groupings. There's CORD and there's Jubilee. And that's how we ended up with the Orengo and Kiraitu committee. So there's a lot of mischief in terms of implementation of the recommendations of the select committee. This mischief arises from the outgoing commissioners, people who are not happy because we kicked them out of office before their time was up. This mischief arises also from the executive, because the outgoing commissioners were seen as blue-eyed boys of the executive. We don't have the goodwill in this country to implement faithfully the recommendations of that select committee. And so, Mike, just to wind up, because you asked a very important question, that why are we not complaining about the Electoral Commission in the US? That our process has not even been implemented. Kenyans don't even know what form and shape it will take. And that should worry everybody. Unlike in the US, where they've had a process and a system for a long time, ours, we don't know who's going to be the chair of the commission. We don't know who will be the commissioners. We don't know what technology will be used.
The point here being, and I'm coming to you, the point here being, we should get to a point where it doesn't matter whether it's Moses Kajwang or it's Mwaura who is the head, because the system is in place the same way. If you look at Donald Trump, there are those narratives that are coming that he's going to kick out 30,000 Kenyans as soon as he takes over the reins. But that may not be possible because there are structures that are in place that would stop him from doing that. Mwaura, maybe just to get from you, now that we already have names, proposed names, and one of them is likely going to be the chair, your feeling, are we heading in the right direction?
Let me start by saying, you know, if there are people who have been mischievous and the whole process has been conned, because as he rightly puts out, they went out to the streets. What was the main agenda, right? If the issue was to change the form and the process, then that should have been, and using his own analogy of changing aspects of this so-called forest, or was it about the monkeys? Because at the end of the day, we are changing the Isaac Hassan people, and we are now bringing new faces. They are still Kenyans, right? We are not investing, and now back to your question about Americans, we're not investing with the process, and we're not investing in the structures that make the process fair or look to be fair. Because at the end of the day, if the Isaac Hassans and all that were all that bad, remember, they came through before the Jubilee administration came into power. So for me, the most important thing would have been, what is it that we didn't want? Is it the people or is it the processes? And what, if it's the processes, what kind of processes do we think that this time round are going to change? And that's why I would probably want to introduce that issue of IEBC also having a say in how we do our primaries. So that now we start looking at changing the form. Because if you are to compare between the US and whatever, and Kenya, right from the primaries for Democrats and Republicans, the system looks to be more organized and more standardized, in the sense that if the elections are closing it by 6, within the next 6 to 12 hours, the results are out, right? Right from the presidential and even for the primaries. For me, the issue should be, how do we change the processes so that it becomes fair? So we can change the people, we can change names here and there, but at the end of the day, because now we'll now start asking, so this person is from central Kenya, or this other person looks to be unfair because he's code leaning or whatever. And the persuasion should not be a matter. For me, is that how do we ensure that the voters' voice is captured and it is transmitted in a way that everyone feels is fair. Now, on the issue of the commissioners having to have left by September 25th, did we want us to have a vacuum at the time? And then, remember, there have been by-elections, which CORD actually won majority of them. At that point, the recent by-elections, I think about 4, which CORD won, I think, 3. At that point, the Isaac Hassan committee is not bad. But when the results is a bit different, then things start changing. So I think we need to look at how do we change the process and make the process foolproof and everyone feels that it's fair. But if we tank around with names, I think we'll still go back to the same situation. And I think we should, the current commissioners should leave when the new ones are coming, so that there should be no vacuum in between.
All right, Senator Moses Kajwang, is it the fault of the select committee that they didn't put the processes in place so that we concentrate more on the processes than the people? And this is a question that we asked even before. And we kept saying, fine, we change the names of the people, but does that change the process?
Mike, the select committee worked under a lot of pressure in terms of time, a lot of pressure in terms of expectation. And I remember they were coming into place against the backdrop of death and bloodshed and destruction of property and loss of revenues for business. So I would not put the blame on the select committee. There are certain areas where they could have done better. For example, they could have put an effective date on the act. There was no effective date, and so we had to wait for a number of days for that act to come into force upon enactment and upon assent by the head of state. That ended up wasting time, which could have been used to kick off the process. The select committee made very good recommendations of the process. It is just that implementation of the recommendations is what is being sabotaged. And that is what we raised a flag on the other day, that we must implement the recommendations faithfully. This issue of the commissioners handing over to another commissioner, Muma Matemu was not told to wait for the next chair to hand over to. There is a secretariat. We have not disbanded the IEBC. It is the commission that is expected to go home. How do you expect a commission that has resigned and tendered their resignation to handle multi-billion shilling procurement issues, to handle strategic issues, to implement a strategic plan of which they have no idea that the incoming commission is going to accept it in its entirety? This is where we are playing games with Kenyans on the implementation of the recommendations. Even on technology, I do believe that within 8 months it is possible to procure the right technology. And I do believe that it's possible to set up a proper consultation framework. There are some regulations that the IEBC has already published on technology. But as a technology specialist, I look at them and I feel that there could be some gaps, and these gaps could be addressed if all players were on board. But even the request to involve and to bring on board political parties through the strength of their representation, even in parliament, is meant to ensure that if these regulations are adopted, and if they're the basis upon which you are developing specifications for procurement and for tender for the electoral technology, then no one is going to cry at the tail end. Everyone is brought on board. It is imperative that political parties and players who represent the aspirations of Kenyans feel they are part of this process. So, Mike, the select committee made very good recommendations on the process, which if we implement properly, then we will get into the elections feeling like the referee has changed, the process has also been good. There's the issue of audit of the voter register. I would have preferred a situation where we would have gone the Nigerian way. In Nigeria, when they realized that they had a voters register that could not be relied upon, just like in Kenya where you have a green book, a blue book, a black book, and a red book, we've got several registers, too many books. They decided to conduct fresh voter registration. And the technology they used was developed by someone who used to work for Google, a Kenyan who is back here in Kenya. So we have the expertise, we have the technology, we have the experience. There would have been nothing very difficult in conducting fresh voter registration, so that we've got a clean register, we've got an opportunity for every Kenyan to vote. The difference with the Americans is this. does an American feel disenfranchised when he wants to get a voter's card as compared to a Kenyan? I was in my county last week, and in my county, there are certain parts, especially those that border Uganda. To get an ID card is a problem because you have to sit through a vetting committee, a committee of elders. You are from Nairobi, you've been brought up in Nairobi, but your parents are from Fangano Island. When you want to apply for an ID in Nairobi, you cannot get that ID in Nairobi. You are told to go back to Mfangano, an island that takes 2 hours by boat to reach, so that you can be vetted by elders. Those are the kind of disenfranchisement strategies that Kenyans face, and Kenyans, especially in opposition strongholds, that need to be dealt with. And that was addressed partially because the Select Committee recommended that ID applications should be processed within 30 days. And so it is just about implementation.
It's about implementation of the recommendation. And I want us to look at the IEBC now taking care of primaries, because it's going to cost the taxpayer quite a lot of money. But before that, are you satisfied with the direction we're taking so far? Before we move on to the IEBC taking care of the primaries for the parties.
My only bit is that when Senator says they have issues with when procurement is coming through, but they do not have issues when the elections is called, is a by-election, and their candidates have won, then I think there should be some, we should have one way of looking at things. When we say we have a problem with the register, but the same register was used in the wards that they won, then I think we're also not being honest with ourselves. I think if the process is about there are few issues that needs to be looked at, then let's look at those issues. If we're saying that, those issues like for the IDs, if there is a vetting committee in Homa Bay, for example, and you're being vetted by elders, who are these elders? They are elders from the same county, right? So we need to find a way of how do we make sure that it now becomes, it's not a punishment for you to be known as a Kenyan. Those things we need to change. And we need to find a way, probably, and for me, we need to find a way, first of all, ensuring that if we got our births registered right from the word go through the counties, and that becomes your form of registration right from the word go, I think that we would be having a challenge to deal with for the next 18 years, but moving forward, we'll have sorted out that thing once and for all. So that in future, when you are born like this, there's a system that captures, and surely, whether you're in Kenya, or you're in Mandera, or you're in Turkana, or in Nairobi, there's a proof that we can go ahead and look at it.
Okay.
And then now the election, but at the end of the day, whether we will force everyone to pick a voter's card or not, it will still remain somebody's choice to vote, and to vote wherever they want to.
But then, Mike, that has been one of the failures of the Jubilee administration. The NAC government initiated the IPRS, the Integrated Population and Registration Service System, which banks have been using, where you can send a message to the IPRS database with an ID number, and you get the rest of the details of a Kenyan. We went ahead and poached a senior official from, I think it was from the Africa Development Bank, and set up a directorate. This directorate, its job was supposed to develop an e-citizen or to come up with an integrated second generation, I think it's fourth generation, it must be fourth generation ID, which would have been one single ID with a chip in it, which would hold your driver's information, your citizens. And a lot of money has been poured into this. I have asked this question in the Senate. I have asked for progress. I have asked for commitment on when this project is expected to go live. And we never got any conclusive answer. These are things that started with the NAC coalition government. We gave them over to Jubilee, and what has happened is that the child has died, or the plant has died because it is not being watered. So we need to...
Questions being asked.
What he says is very nice and very proactive, but he's not the first one to think about it. It's just that, again, implementation. And I think our government has got a very poor track record.
And that's why he's in the Senate, and that's why the Senate needs to be checking government and ensuring that if we come up with this kind of proactive ideas, that they also
follow through to the end.
I've asked a ministerial question,
and that's when I think, and I think the party should also take it up as an issue and be able to champion instead of all these smoke screens that we all see around.
I want us to move on to something else. And the president earlier, as Jubilee Party was being launched, made a statement which, of course, ruffled a few. And this was in regards to the IEBC being responsible for running the primaries. But we've also now had a change of wind, as it were, when you listen to what the president had to say and what the Majority Leader, Eden Duale, had to say regarding the IEBC funding and taking care of the primaries. But let's listen in, then we can talk about that briefly before we finish.
Pesa tulipe IEBC wasimamie uchaguzi wetu, ndio haki ya mwananchi itendeke.
You know, when the president says tutatafuta pesa, it means tafuta pesa from the exchequer. He is the head of the executive. So that is the true meaning of the president. Now, the president says tutatafuta pesa within our budgetary estimates. As the head of the executive is the one that brings the budget.
Moses Kajong, your thoughts on that? Should the IEBC be the one to fund the primaries for Jubilee Party?
I think, first of all, Jubilee is a very confused house. It is a house that is not built on any philosophical basis, with the exception that Uhuru Kenyatta must be the next president. Everyone else, including my brother here, will be thrown under the bus. It will be up to you. It is one big party. It's either you are given a certificate or not, and if you don't get a certificate, whether free and fair, it is upon you to stand as an independent, and we've already closed that window of party hopping. So Jubilee has, I'm looking for a much politer word to use, but Jubilee has played its membership because it does not care about anyone down the food chain. It only cares about the ambitions of the president.
They could argue and say,
I don't think so. I don't think so. Because
let me qualify. Let me give you evidence so that you can deal with that with the evidence that I'm giving you. Because first of all, you're looking at a party without structures. We're looking at a party that has never had elections. We're looking at a party without officials. You're looking at a party where the so-called officials are people who are announced on the front porch of State House. So Jubilee has got absolutely no capacity to conduct its own nominations because it has got no structures. And that is why it looks at IEBC as an option. Unfortunately, in terms of funding, Parliament has not allocated a budget to the IEBC to conduct nominations. Assuming that Jubilee has got a presence in roughly less than half of this country, if IEBC was to manage their nominations, it would be like a mini general election. Where will the money come from? Will they be ready? Will they have set up structures? And then we in ODM, if we made a similar demand that IEBC manages our nomination, then nomination day will be like a general election. Have we provided those funds? I believe that the first thing that every party must do is to develop its internal capacity to manage nominations so that IEBC comes in as a complementary organization. But you don't wake up and form a party and you don't set up structures, and then you want to throw all your problems to IEBC.
We are running out of time, so I need him to respond to that.
Let me say something. if there is a party that knows the direction it's taking, is Jubilee, because we have no shadow of doubt who's our presidential candidate and who's going to be his running mate. For CORD, the confusion, that's where we actually don't know who they're going to pull up as CORD. And secondly, you must give it to Jubilee that it took the bull by its horns and attempted to grow the democracy from so many fragmented parties to one big party called Jubilee. And remember, it's an amalgamation of more than 11 parties that are coming together. Surely you cannot also expect us to have all these structures put in place, and Jubilee was actually formed this year. What we can rely on is the history of the parties that came in to form Jubilee. So for me, and for what is of most benefit is to understand that the reason why we would prefer that the IEBC conducts the primaries, because that's where the crux of the matter is. And if the senator would be even candid, he would tell you that the issue has never been at the top there. The issues always arise between the president and the MCA, who becomes who where. Mm-hmm. And that's where, if parties, including ODM that they were cutting cakes the other day for 10 years, their primaries have always been a sham, including their...
But one might argue at least they've had primaries. At least they've
but then again, Jubilee was born the other month, right? Okay. So we are saying that we would want a process that is fair and foolproof, because give Nairobi, for example. If you put Nairobi, how many strong candidates want to be governor for Nairobi, right? And how do you put a process that will ensure that whoever becomes the Jubilee candidate to face CORD is foolproof and the process was fair?
I'll have to cut you short because of time. Time is really not on our side. That music means it's time up. But thank you very much, gentlemen. Moses Kajwang, Senator for Homa Bay, and also Chege Maura, who is an MCA in Ngara. Thank you very much. That's the state of the nation currently.